All right, Alexander, we have got the NATO conference in Madrid. I'm sure one of the topics that is going to be discussed is going to be Kaliningrad and Lithuania and what's going on there, which is just a really weird development in that the EU was actually trying to find an off-ramp to the sanctions that they put in place, of which Lithuania decided to adhere to the letter, maybe too much, and the EU said, maybe you guys in Lithuania are taking this too far, and so let's find an off-ramp. And then Lithuania said, no chance, we want to continue to escalate. So I think people are kind of looking on as to what's going on in Kaliningrad and scratching their heads saying, what a bizarre situation where the EU is actually trying to find a way out of this mess. And it's Lithuania that is actually defying the EU and is trying to ramp things up. And all of this is based on a fourth and fifth sanctions package, which was delivered by the European Union, and for which Lithuania is basing their blockade on. Just a strange development.
It's a very strange development, but it's a good example of what the trap the EU, or shall we don't say the EU, the big European countries, Germany, France, primarily, but Italy, Spain also, the trap they've walked into. Because what they've now got themselves into is a situation where they're no longer in control. Lithuania is. Lithuania, this little country which wants to confront everybody. China, Russia, is perfectly happy to provoke World War III, as we've seen, is now in a position where it's able to dictate to the EU, to Germany, to France, to Italy, to Spain. So the Germans, the French, the Italians and the Spanish come along. They say to the Lithuania, look, you're taking all this much too literally. You didn't consult with us properly. We've got to find a way around. What you're doing is clearly contrary to international law, which it is. By the way, that's now been said all over the world. I gather that's also the position informally of the Indian government, but also lots of other governments. You're also creating a crisis in Europe, because you're interfering with Russian internal trade, the internal trade that Russia carries out within its own territory, which is not what the purpose of our sanctions is. So you've got to row back, and Lithuania says no. And of course, the reason Lithuania is doing that is because they've been put up to do this by the neocons in Washington. And you see the arch neocon, Jens Stoltenberg, who's now coming along, the arch European neocon, the person who is in effect the neocons' representative in Europe. And of course, he's coming along. He says, after strategic briefings to the Financial Times about how Estonia could be occupied by Russia, and it would take 180 days for NATO to liberate it. So Stoltenberg comes along on behalf of NATO, proposes a plan at the NATO summit in Madrid for a 300,000-man army to take on the Russians. And he's going to say the threats to Lithuania, the threats to Estonia are the reason, even though, as we have seen, it is Lithuania itself that has created this crisis. So Germany, France, Italy, Spain, they didn't want to get into this situation, but they've been maneuvered into it by their own crazy sanctions policy. If they take a step back and think what they've done, well, I think they would probably start to worry that what they're doing is they're signing themselves up ultimately for World War III, because though I think this 300,000-man army that Stoltenberg is talking about is smoke and mirrors, it's just redesignating soldiers who are already there in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, whatever, into mobile units that can be sent into battle at short notice. I don't think it actually means any significant build-up over and above and beyond what is already there. The very fact that he's talking in this way, the very fact that he's talking about pouring troops into Lithuania and whatever, is now going to create a crisis point, a military crisis point in Europe, which the Russians can't ignore. At some point, the Russians will want to resolve this, and resolve this comprehensively and decisively. Now, I don't think they're going to do it tomorrow or next year, but sooner or later they will. A crisis has been created in Europe. It's been done intentionally, and the Germans and the French and the British and all the others, by agreeing to this sanctions package, have opened their way to it.
Yeah, it's so similar to Ukraine, isn't it? In that this could easily be resolved, just like Ukraine could have been easily resolved. The Russians will wait it out. They'll be patient. They'll find ways to circumvent the problem. But eventually, with each warning, and each warning is going to get louder and louder with regards to Kaliningrad, just like Ukraine, eventually the Russians will decide to solve this in whichever way they decide to solve it. Right now, they're going to just circumvent things with the shipment of goods via sea, and that's how they're going to deal with it. But if Lithuania doesn't wise up and see what happened in Ukraine, then we're going to have a lot of trouble coming down the line in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. Who knows?
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
you mentioned Lithuania as a hotspot. They're trying to stir up trouble in Georgia, the EU.
I know.
They're trying to stir up trouble in Moldova, and you have Syria. So you definitely can see 4 pressure points that the West is trying to hit upon in order to create trouble for Russia as they're engaged in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely, completely true. The only thing I would say is Lithuania and Kaliningrad are by far the most dangerous, because they impact on Russian national and security interests. I mean, Kaliningrad is Russian territory, and Russia must defend it, and it must protect the people there. So Russia will eventually move. I mean, it's inevitable. If blockades are enforced against Kaliningrad in this way, and of course, if there's any attempt to interfere with shipping between Russia, between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, then that's, we're looking at a potentially explosive situation. And you see that the Russians have already taken the first military step. They've announced that Belarus will receive Iskander missiles. And Putin was very careful to point out that these missiles can carry nuclear weapons. So if there's any deployments, Western deployments in Lithuania, particularly if there's threats to introduce nuclear weapons into Lithuania or the Baltic states, the Russians are there on the ground. They've already got the missiles in Belarus. They can install the nuclear weapons quickly, and then they'll move. But that's the crisis that we have. So Georgia, certainly a problem. Moldova, definitely a problem. Syria, also a problem. But if you want to put your finger on the really dangerous one, it's Lithuania and Kaliningrad. And this, as you absolutely rightly said, this crisis should not exist, because there was an international treaty which Lithuania signed. If it's observed that treaty, then there would never have been a problem. That's why you have treaties like this.
Well, the same could be said about the Minsk Accords.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you had Russian hackers, by the way. One of the news, real quick, one of the things that has happened with Kaliningrad, with Lithuania, was that you had Russian hackers go into Lithuania and cause some trouble there. So that's just an update.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're going to see much more of this. And I mean, it's all very well for Stoltenberg to talk about securing the position of Lithuania in the same way that Berlin, West Berlin, was secured by the West. The problem is that the Russians, the Soviets, never had an imperative need to occupy Berlin. There wasn't the need to move to Berlin, because Berlin was not part of their territory. Kaliningrad is part of Russia's territory. So the Russian calculus here is completely different. And I'm going to say something else. Stoltenberg can talk whatever he wants, but the actual reality is that the United States is not going to fight and go into World War III for Lithuania. I mean, that's my own personal view, but I think that's the reality of it. I think there's a
Do you think
crisis.
there's
They're not going to risk World War III for Lithuania. Carry on.
I was going to ask you, do you think there's any country in the world that is going to risk World War III for Lithuania, NATO or non-NATO? Any citizens of the world that are going to say, given the circumstances as to how this came about, that they're going to actually risk World War III for
No,
Lithuania? I mean, that's my question.
no, I don't. I mean, the country that might come closest to doing that would be Poland, which has long historic connections with Lithuania. But I don't think even Poland ultimately would. Perhaps this particular Polish government that we see might do, but especially if Ukraine, the Ukraine is defeated, as you know, I expect and we expect, then I think even Poland is going to be, unwilling to go down this route. And can I just say, I mean, coming back to Ukraine, and I was reading today an article in the Daily Telegraph, which is, very close to British government thinking, and it made a point which we have actually made before in our programs. If Ukraine is defeated, if Russia visibly wins in Ukraine, and all the indications are that that's the trajectory of travel, that's where we're heading towards, then the reality is that NATO's credibility is going to be massively weakened. And countries like Poland are going to start to reassess their position, because they will say at the end of the day, NATO threw everything it had at Ukraine and at Russia, and it didn't work. So we're dangerously exposed here if we continue to take this path. And in Poland, we're a big, sophisticated country, which they are, and we can certainly understand these things. Lithuania has its exotic, quixotic views. Quixotic views, not exotic views. It's quixotic views, its particular grievances. But realistically, we're not going to fight to defend Lithuania, because after what happened in Ukraine, we have no realistic expectation that any of the other big NATO powers, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, or indeed the United States, will fight for Lithuania either.
Yeah, the one scenario that I could see, if we're like game playing this out, I don't know if this continues on the path that is continuing and Russia does win in Ukraine, which is what it looks like at this moment in time, but Lithuania continues to defy the EU, which is incredible that you say that, but Lithuania defies the EU's orders, and they continue to listen to the neocons, and they remain firm on their blockade of Kaliningrad. Wouldn't the most natural thing to happen, the most logical thing to happen in the medium to long term, is that Russia just takes that sliver of land and creates their own path towards Kaliningrad, and they just own that area? I mean, wouldn't that
Yeah,
be like the most logical path that Russia take? Doesn't
absolutely.
Lithuania realize that? I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, it's entirely, you're completely right. That's exactly what the Russians would quite possibly do. And then again, does the West risk World War III because the Russians take that thin, small sliver of land? I mean, that's the big question. But Lithuania has brought this on itself. It's created this crisis. Let me repeat again, until a few weeks ago, this crisis did not exist. Lithuania has created this. This is an extraordinarily unwise step by, frankly, a reckless and very foolish government that has got carried away by its own extreme Russophobia. I don't know, by the way, whether all of the Lithuanian people share these feelings. I hope some of them don't. And who knows, it may be that in future elections things might change in Lithuania. I don't know the country well, but this government has taken an unbelievably reckless and stupid step. And, the Lithuanian president was saying, that Lithuania won't agree to corridors. They might find that some of their territory will be taken from them and will be made into a corridor. And at that point, of course, once that happens, the reality will also probably sink in too late that the NATO guarantees to Lithuania are a dead letter.
Yeah. If I was NATO, I would be telling Lithuania to back off, given the fact
Absolutely.
that NATO has completely proven ineffective in Ukraine as well. If I was NATO, I would say, we can't rack up another loss. Our weapons are showing that they're ineffective. Our military is showing that it's ineffective. We've thrown everything at Russia. It hasn't worked. We don't need another L in Lithuania. That's the way that I would see it if I was Stoltenberg. I would say,
Well, absolutely.
enough's enough.
But of course he does. There's the trouble, and that's what makes this crisis so dangerous. Because you're absolutely right. That's exactly what NATO should be doing. They should be telling Lithuania, for heaven's sake, back off. We're not prepared to support you over your violation of an international treaty. That's what they should be saying to Lithuania. But of course, they're not saying that. What they're saying instead is that they're going to build up this 300,000 man army to take on Russia, and that Lithuania will be as secure as Berlin was during the Cold War. And I mean, they're making commitments which they can't ultimately honour. And if they try to honour them, they increase risks to delirious levels. But as we said many times, these people just don't have a reverse gear. And until, I have to say this, until this administration in Washington changes, which is a very dangerous administration, it's made commitments to Ukraine, to Taiwan, which are dangerous commitments to make, provocative commitments to make. It's now making commitments via NATO to Lithuania. Until this very dangerous administration we have in Washington is changed, then I'm afraid things are just going to go on going from bad to worse.
Yeah, I agree. Until something changes in Washington, the Europeans have proven completely ineffective. And it's only going to come from the U.S. that things are going to turn around. And that means, that means a change in something in the governance of the
Well,
United States,
absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, when we have a situation, a ridiculous situation, where Berlin, Paris, Madrid, and Rome are dictated to by Lithuania, I mean, that tells you how bankrupt European diplomacy has become.
Yeah. All right. We will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, everybody, and check us out on the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.